Hello and welcome to The Green Room by Deloitte, an award-winning podcast where we explore the topics that matter most in business. I'm Annie Wong and this is episode 65, where we ask, do elections change anything?
Understandably, they're just not getting the message, or they're not being convinced that politics and other institutions have the answers.
Politics is not just about responding to what people want, because if democracy were voting on a kind of control where you just press buttons, then, well, it would be absolute chaos.
They can be both cynical but also have huge expectations of what government can do, because they know only government can effect some of these changes.
Really, since the financial crisis, businesses have had to face a world in which external factors intrude into the decisions that businesses make.
Everyone, and welcome back to The Green Room. If you're just joining us for the first time, you can find all of our 60 plus episodes wherever you get your pods, and we are also on YouTube. Each episode we tackle a different topic, varying from tech to climate to the importance of inclusion and the future of work. Today's episode is a big one. 2024 is a huge year for elections. Billions of us across the globe will be casting our vote here in the UK, in the US, South Africa, Taiwan, Ukraine, Mexico, and many more. But casting a vote is one thing, driving meaningful change is another thing entirely. And so our big topic of today is, do elections change anything? We'll be discussing the history and meaning of elections, what frames an election and how people vote, the future of democratic elections, and of course, our big topic, do elections change anything? I'm delighted to be joined by my co-host, Ethan. How are you? Our first episode of 2024 together.
Yeah, great to be joined by you. And as you say, more than half the world's population are set or have the right to vote in 2024, which is absolutely crazy. And unsurprisingly, the UK is one of those countries, as at one point in the not so distant past, it felt like we had an election every other week. So
yes.
Looking forward to getting back to the polls.
But as always, we can't possibly do this alone. So we have two wonderful guests with us. Who have we got with us today?
So this week we're joined by the Rt Hon Caroline Flint, who served as a Labour MP for 22 years, including 6 years as a government minister and 5 as Shadow Secretary of State. Thank you so much for joining us today, Caroline.
Delighted to be here.
And we're also joined by Ian Stewart, a partner here at Deloitte and the UK firm's chief economist. Great to see you again, Ian.
Well, good to be back.
And so voting. So it's a democratic right, it's a civic duty, and something perhaps we take for granted, something that people have fought for many years, and something that lots of people still don't have. So first things first, why do you think elections are important, if you do think so?
Well, first of all, there's many features to democracy, but you cannot have a democratic country without having open, transparent elections. They are a must. If that doesn't exist, you're not a democracy. So I think it's really important for that reason to start off with. But there's many other aspects of this. I mean, first of all, I think it is that opportunity for people to express their views and their will, and having that in a way that that's accessible, that's transparent, and that's meaningful is really important. And I'm sure we'll get into this later on. Not all elections have those factors at play when they take place. I think it is about that recognition is that the politicians serve the people and not the other way around. It's not always clear-cut, it's not always neat, it's often messy, but actually it is a really important opportunity, I think, to get in touch with the feel of the nation and how people are feeling, but also for them to express that as well. And it's an opportunity for renewal. It is an opportunity for a change of government. And even if the government doesn't change, potentially for that government to think about how it's been received, because even if you win, you may not win by that much. And that, you would hope, would also have an influence on whoever wins on the end of the day. There's lots of other reasons, but I think they, for me, are very much up there as the top priorities.
And would you echo that sentiment?
Yeah, the interesting thing about democracy and elections is that if you think about kind of human existence, I mean, democracy is kind of relatively recent. I mean, you can obviously go back to ancient Athens, but kind of human existence. I mean, modern democracies really evolved over, 250 years. I mean, the sort of franchise, the gradual extension of the franchise. I think the point we've arrived at is it's a tiny fraction of human history, and it's kind of an interesting question. Why have we ended up here? And I think it's this question of how you reconcile different views and people who actually disagree, they just permanently disagree, in a way which ensures there's consent within a population. And I think what we found is that democracy is a very good way of doing it. And as Caroline says, it's kind of deeply imperfect, but it is a wonderful way of having a free debate about ideas and choosing in a way which means there is consent on the part not just of the winners but also of the losers, because we know, well, if you're in a proper democratic system, you know that in another 4 or 5 years' time there's going to be another election. So I think it is an incredibly kind of precious thing that we have, and I think sometimes we don't quite remember that. It's something which has been a product of a tremendous struggle over a very long time to create this system. And although I think at the moment we're probably going to talk about this, the tendency is to kick it and to focus on its deficiencies. I think it's something which is hard to build, incredibly hard to build, because most of the world does not have the kind of form of democracy we have in the West, and it's quite easy to break.
The power side of it is interesting, but also I think it's also, in some ways, sort of elections, it is about renewal. But for advanced and mature democracies as well, if you've already established, for example, access to education for children, access to healthcare, and other sort of public policies that have become part of, if you like, the landscape, they're not new. Part of it is as well, and I think this is where the consensus comes into it from one government to another and a change of government, is that consensus that even though political parties, when you were taking this, legislation through, might have voted against it, if it becomes part of what people see as this is the sort of society we want, it becomes part of that consensus amongst politics. Again, I can remember as a new MP that certain laws that we were introducing, just to give an example, the national minimum wage, I think, the other parties, Conservatives and Liberals, both voted against it. But the truth is, in subsequent elections, they haven't overturned it. It has become part of the landscape. It's become part of what people from all backgrounds, no matter how they vote, think, actually, that's what we want. And so it moves on. Social change is another example in terms of rights for gay people and other rights for people as well. Huge arguments and not unity, but actually when you work through it, and our democracy enables this to happen, actually if you can come out with a consensus on the other side, it becomes part of what people expect, and there's not as much difference between the parties as maybe some people think, which then cues accusations of you're all boring and you're all the same and you don't do anything and all of that goes on. Sometimes, steady as she goes, good progress is not a bad thing.
Just to go back to your point around the evolution of modern democracy and elections, your point that, women getting the vote, working class men, a lot more engagement and activism within politics over time. Yeah. I think some people would argue that there's also been an increase in apathy, distrust, or even disenfranchisement. Over your time in government, how would you say you saw that change?
Well, I think there has always been certain amount of apathy and cynicism about these things. And I suppose as well is that whilst, even our own democracy in this country is relatively new, certainly in terms of, the franchise today compared to just over 100 years ago, there's always been cynicism about politicians and how they operate. You've only got to go back a few centuries to see some of the scurrilous pamphlets that were written and satires about politicians. It's nothing new in that sense. But I think at the same time, people do have expectations. They can be both cynical but also have huge expectations of what government could do, because they know only government can effect some of these changes. And I think part of it stems from, and again we might get into this later, about what do people want. I think wherever people live in the world, under whatever circumstances, they're really concerned about themselves, their families and the place where they live. Fundamentally, they want security and they want to have opportunity. And part of politics is how do you sort of speak to that and make sure you're listening to that. And I certainly, when it comes to more abstract policies for people, how you connect them to why saving the planet and tackling climate change is really meaningful to someone in their community and where they are and makes sense. So I think we shouldn't get too worried about apathy, because I think it has its peaks and troughs. I think what we should get worried about is when there's a sense that actually politics can't find any answers, or politicians are seen to be not listening, because that's where I think in that vacuum more divisive elements can take root.
I think it's really interesting, your point around politicians losing touch. Do you think that people tend to vote on like multiple issues that concern them, and what are those issues? Or do you think in reality a lot of voters do pick a singular thing that they care about, immigration, taxation, and that is how they tend to vote on a single issue?
I would say my experience is that there's usually been three, main issues for about the last I would say about the last 15 years in my time as an MP. And they were the economy, and I think that's always going to be there. I think it goes back to, first and foremost, people are thinking about, well, how is this going to affect me? How is this going to affect my family? How is this going to affect my kids and the place where I live? So what's the economy going to look like? Am I going to get a job? Am I going to get a pay rise? Who's going to pay for this? How am I going to be supported? I think those all factor in. And then within that also is competence. Is the government competent to do this? I think the other issue is often public services, and particularly I would say, health. People worried about their health. And again, what's interesting too on that front is, compared to when I first became an MP, social care wasn't talked about very much, even though probably, people did have information about how demographics were changing and our population getting older. And of course, people, because of good health, surviving, but with difficult conditions as they got older as well. That has always been an issue. How many times have I been in an election where someone said, I think we've used it in my own party, 24 hours to save the NHS, the National Health Service and this sort of thing. So that's always up there. I think immigration has also gone up too. And I suppose in terms of global issues, probably it's the global impact of migration that's become much more a feature in terms of things. And again, I don't think that's because people are against all immigration. I think they're just concerned about how it's being managed and how it's being developed. And that links again to things maybe, it might be irrationally sometimes, but how's this going to affect my job? It's really difficult to go and see a doctor. There's huge queues. Schools are full. Where's the housing? It then plays into that. It's quite rare, I think, for most people to have something that's a big single issue. There are some. For some, it will be climate change. But when I was Shadow Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, I'm sort of, in that sense, a sort of someone who is also pragmatic about, well, how do we actually join the dots for people to see when these big conferences are happening, and in language that obviously is really over the most people's heads, pretty abstract as well on a day-to-day, even though we're getting more floods and more intemperate weather and extreme weather conditions in the UK as elsewhere in the world, and climate may be a factor in all of that, is how do you connect it to people? So for me, it was always about, what happens in another part of the world could be happening here, the climate and the impact on climate. We actually link it to jobs and education and skills. We can create new jobs, we can create new industries, we can adapt to this and make those connections with people. Again, all roads lead back to that values thing for people. And I think sometimes, politics isn't very good at that. And that's again where there will be these highbrow conversations in language that is fit for that sort of environment. But the task is really on politicians and anyone who wants to influence businesses as well, is how do you tell the story? How do you communicate that to people for whom, they've got lives where they cannot go to conferences, they are not sitting listening to this, but they have values, and given the right conversation, they can see the connections.
We've recently published our Deloitte State of the State report in conjunction with Think Tank Reform.
Yeah.
And I think, firstly, I think they do mention the things that you've said, the big concerns around NHS waiting lists, economy and immigration. But they've also have a specific section on climate change. I think one of the stats that stood out to me was that 70% of respondents don't believe that the UK will hit their net zero target. It'd be good to hear from you guys if you think, A, is that something that's felt globally around, okay, there might be this ambition on paper, but governments collectively aren't going to deliver on this? And B, if that's a symptom of a wider problem around the difficulty, particularly in these short-term election cycles, of delivering these big changes and these multilateral changes.
I think there is a real problem for democracies, and this is something which authoritarian governments don't have, is that there is an election cycle. There has to be an election cycle, and yet in reality, many of the really big decisions we face are kind of multi-year decisions. I mean, they might, they're intergenerational decisions. So something like pensions or infrastructure or defence are, they're very long-term decisions. And so how do you reconcile the pressures around, the NHS and employment, which are incredibly important drivers of how people vote, with a whole set of other things which are everyone would say they're important. I mean, defence is very, very important, and perhaps we've become more conscious of that recently. But it's probably, there aren't going to be many voters for whom it's going to be a really big issue. Climate is clearly this sort of existential example of this problem. That people called it the tragedy of horizons. You can see the problem, but how do you get people to take action now, the payback on which is not going to accrue for 50 or 100 years? We're having to do things now. We need to be doing things now, which will benefit our children's children and so on. Something we haven't talked about so far, but I think this is perhaps a challenge for political leadership. And I think this doesn't get I think we've become slightly resigned about politics. So we think of politicians being hemmed in by events, by uncertainty, high debt levels, inflation, populism, social media, all the things we've talked about. And so saying, well, actually, politicians don't have much agency. And I think, Caroline reminded us, the government of which she was part changed the climate of opinion on, say, the minimum wage and on gay rights. Mrs. Thatcher's government changed the climate of opinion on the role of unions or defence. I mean, Attlee's government changed the shape of the state in a fundamental way. And so I think we underestimate actually the agency and the power of leadership. And I think, the point is that these people, all in different ways, they use the power of their office and the power of oratory to persuade people. And I think politics is not just about responding to what people want, because if democracy were voting on a kind of control where you just press buttons, then it would be absolute chaos. It would be unmanageable because we'd all change our mind all the time. So politicians having to arbitrate and make decisions on our behalf. And I think this. So I a very long-winded answer, but I think it is something about the power of leadership. Actually.
And it's also about change, isn't it? It's about change, and part of politics is dealing with the present day problems, but also looking ahead, future. The challenge then is, once you've got permission through an election, is what do you do with that? And I think one of the tests of politics and of governments is how you help people cope with change. Because change, whether you're inspiring it or whether it's happening as a result of something else, to a certain extent, out of everyday politicians' hands, is a major task that on behalf of the people serving the people. How do we help people cope with technology? How do we help people cope with these events that are happening globally that they don't really have a lot of purchase on or power? Because people, understandably, politicians don't help people cope with change, then they're likely to become fearful, and they're likely to become worried, and they're likely to become potentially more insular and narrow, and sometimes, sadly, open to views that are, not helpful and negative, and want to put a stop. We're not going to do anything about climate change. It's too difficult. And that is the challenge, to not allow those voices, whether it's on climate change or other things that have to be tackled, have to be dealt with, are done in a way which takes populations, with everybody, with politicians, whether it's nationally or globally.
Did you know at Deloitte we support social enterprises through our 5 Million Futures programme? Like Change Please. They use 100% of the profits from their award-winning coffee to help people experiencing homelessness. They offer training, employment and ongoing support with housing, finances and therapy. Why not sign up to the Change Please Coffee Club to receive weekly deliveries of coffee beans? Or try out one of their blends? Just head to changeplease.org. Now back to our topic of the day. Do you think the more globalised world that we live in makes it more difficult to enact change locally?
No, I don't, because I've never thought that because we can't do everything and because some things are global, that should paralyse us from doing the things we can do. And I think it goes back to your point, Ian. Sometimes it can feel sort of like difficult and, oh goodness, can we do anything? The economy is not that great. We haven't got enough money, or it's very complicated. But I think to a certain extent that just requires, just rethinking, resetting how we're thinking about things. Stretches may be, resources may be stretched, But maybe we should just be smarter about how we use resources to affect change. Maybe we should be, and this was part of the work that, Deloitte did with reform, was maybe, we've been doing things in a certain type of way. Maybe we need to work in a different way. Maybe we should focus on the delivery side of things as much as we do the policy infrastructure. Perhaps we should be doing, actually, dare I say it, less of this, because it's not having that much of an impact. I mean, people who are doing it love doing it, because that's their world and that's really important. But you know what? Actually, let's just stand back a bit. It's not really having that much impact. Less of that, but prioritise it over here. And I really think that's a sort of, again, can be both stimulating and creative. The outputs could be better, but also I think they're quite, they're not that hard to communicate to the public about why you're doing some of those things. Fundamentally, on lots of services, it's not necessarily who's providing it, it's whether they're getting the service they need. And so within that space, again, I think there's lots about change that could be done. But there's sometimes an inertia that sets in, I think, by policymakers, both political policymakers and others, to not really be, as agile and creative as they might be.
Just on the point around global and local, we've got an economist in the room as well. Do you think there's any truth to the idea that politicians are more constrained now by kind of global capital? Like we saw that quite recently, that if you spook the markets, that can be instant feedback from unelected people that can tank a government. And would Attlee potentially have, back in the day, if he'd said he was going to create a national health system?
I think we exaggerate this. I mean, so in 1956, during the Suez Crisis, so UK, Israel, US, not US, sorry, France, seized the Suez Canal. I mean, what caused that to stop was that America said it wouldn't backstop the UK, it wouldn't continue to help fund our balance of payments, and it just pulled the rug from under Eden. And so capital's always been important. I mean, in fighting wars, capital and the ability to finance yourself is absolutely fundamental, and that has depended on doing so internationally. So this isn't new. I mean, markets, capital movements have become freer since 1979, and that is a global phenomenon. I think we underestimate the agency of politicians, and actually I think we underestimate the good politicians can do. And I mean, two things which I think they're good examples. The Western world, in the last 15 years, has seen two of the biggest shocks it's seen in modern history. We're talking about 200 years. So the global financial crisis was a staggering crisis. It could easily have gone the way of the Great Depression. I mean, the pandemic was, I thought in my career the financial crisis was going to set the standard for how bad things can get. I mean, the pandemic, this economy contracted by, about 15% in the space of about 2 months. This is kind of off the scale stuff. And what I think is incredible is the action on both occasions, which is not beyond criticism of governments, prevented mass unemployment, it kept people fed, it prevented a breakdown of law order, and it prevented a wider contagion. And we just underestimate the success of government. Actually, this isn't a partisan standpoint. This isn't about the UK. It's about Europe. It's about North America. Yeah. It's something I'm particularly interested in is that I used to work in politics, and I won't say on which side, Caroline.
I know.
I know. Oh, okay. Well, we're on the same side then. But a very long time ago. And when I was in politics, there were three things that politicians were really obsessed with. One was high unemployment. The second one was inflation. And the third was pension and poverty. Yeah. And what is remarkable now is unemployment is at vanishingly low levels, not just here, but in places like Germany. We brought unemployment down. Inflation is running at low levels, and pension and poverty in the UK it still exists, it's still a problem, much less of a problem. Those things have resulted from the decisions of politicians. And these are huge achievements, and I think we sometimes, in our rush to criticise politicians, there's a lack of understanding of what has been achieved.
We are affected by, what's happening globally. I think one of the big challenges is technology and how we use it. How we can make it, how do politicians actually influence it as one government? I mean, lots of national governments are working through legislations, aren't they? Issues around online safety, but also confidentiality, access to information, data sharing, all these issues. That's dominating, I think, a lot of the debate in the UK and elsewhere. And there are these challenges. But again, we have global influences, but also national influences can also affect global events. And that's why on some of the big issues, there is a role for national governments to lead and seek an alliance of the willing, I think, again, on some of those big issues like climate change, to be that coherent voice at the sort of international tables, not just a voice, but also to set an example as well. As you can't tell other people to do things if you're not willing to do some of these things yourself, that's for sure.
I want to go back to some of your points around polarisation, because I think a lot of listeners may argue that we've seen, the left becoming more left and the right becoming more right. And so you could argue that a lot of change in government is spent, reversing old policies rather than implementing new change. But to your point, Ian, around certain governments creating incredibly long-lasting change, arguably there is a lot more consensus and centrist politics now, especially with the voting system that we have in this country. Coupling that with the long-term, short-term conflict between what goals you're trying to achieve, how do you think government should best be balancing that kind of short-term problems that people are facing versus wanting to instigate long-term change?
I think it is incumbent on politicians to try to explain, and there's a huge role of communication, and politics is about communication. It's not just receiving instructions from voters, it's trying to explain the trade-offs and the choices. And actually, I think this is a dilemma, because quite reasonably politicians would like to be popular, but they must necessarily do some things which will not be popular. And I think that is just a reality of political leadership. And transformational leaders, and I think Blair was, Mrs. Thatcher was, I think you see them taking decisions which were, they went against the grain, for better and for worse. But I think we need to recognise that our politicians are sometimes going to tell us things that we probably don't want to hear. And I think we should also listen to our politicians. And so I think we should kind of try to respect them. And we just want something I feel very strongly is that there's a tremendous amount of incredible information produced from parliaments, from things like select committees, government reports. And so I think part of this, and this, I really do mean this, is that we need to understand the decisions, the trade-offs that politicians face. So there's no simple solution. We also have to inure ourselves as voters to politicians sometimes doing things that we think, we'd prefer not to do that. I think we've got to try to see a longer view ourselves. Yeah.
Clearly, there's some areas of policy that are not started in one parliament and not going to be finished by the end of that parliament. And actually, in terms of policy development and particularly big changes, the idea and getting the legislation through to actually starting to deliver, can take a long time. And in some ways, rightly so, because big infrastructure politics, working in partnership with business, working in partnership with, for example, local government and others who have an into something like that, takes time, doesn't it? I think, so I think public understand that. What they need assurance on is that the right decisions are being made, that the project's being managed well, and actually it will deliver. So I think people understand what they get impatient about is where they see money being wasted, a lack of flexibility, and are not willing to sort of make some changes. The good thing about that as well is that long term is actually what quite a lot of those who want to invest want to hear. They want a policy that is stretched out beyond a parliament. Because, whether it's a pension fund or whether it's our energy generation, these things have to last a long time. You can't just say, we suddenly changed our mind on this. So that's important. However, elections are also an opportunity for voters to make a judgment about how you made a more immediate decision in government. So actually the pandemic, I think, is probably a good example of that. And it was interesting what you were saying about that. I think actually who had ever been in government during that time would probably have faced, they would definitely have faced the same challenges, and they probably would have come to some of the same decisions about supporting people who couldn't get to work with the furlough schemes and all of this. But these are part of the issues people are judged on. It's not the only issue they're judged on, but how competent they were in dealing with a crisis like the pandemic, When something else has happened that might be quite an isolated event, how did they respond to that? Because it's as much about how they deal with events as they happen in real time, not just the subject of the event itself. I think short term and long term is just part of the wonderful tapestry.
Part of the job.
Part of the wonderful tapestry of being in
No,
politics.
you go.
Your point around knowing whether a short-term policy or decision is going well and getting a good indication from people, do you think the same applies for businesses, being able to sense check the effect on businesses and how they are then preparing for that long-term, short-term trade-off?
Yeah, I think it's as important in any place where you are making sort of big decisions. I chair a health trust, and so that's important for us, where we're looking at long-term policies for our services as well as the short-term, how we assess risk and deal with that as well. And I think likewise for business too. I think the other thing I would say about this is applicable to business as it is to politics, is also just being curious about what's happening. So I do some work in the energy space around fuel poverty. And of course, we've seen these huge shocks in terms of prices going up and the impact that's had on a lot of people. A more general affordability issue, but for those on very low incomes living in very poorly insulated homes. And, you know, again, sometimes in that area, the energy sector has not been always that great in understanding what the impacts of that is happening on the ground with their customers. And sometimes in some cases, there's been a failure, I think, of curiosity at the top to understand what's happening through the sort of chain of command to the front line. That's as applicable in business, I think, as it is in politics as well. Curiosity is wanting to know how things are working. Are they actually delivering what we decided at the board? You know, where it's actually happening is really, really, really important.
What do you think, Ian? Do you agree on the point?
I think actually in all endeavours, I mean, government's one, business another, but everything, I think actually scepticism, openness and systems which allow challenge are very important. It's why things like select committees are very, very important. It's also why I think politics benefits from having independently minded backbenchers. I think actually in every area these are good qualities. I mean, it also means that it's very important that we don't fall in love with ideas. I mean, there's plenty of evidence of this in business and government, of things being pushed through. Ex post, people will look at it and say, how on earth did they do that? Well, because of an excess of faith in a particular scheme and an insufficiency of scepticism. So I think scepticism and openness are very, very important.
And have you got any advice for how businesses could prepare for elections, given that half the world's population is potentially voting in one this year?
I think most elections are binary, aren't they? I think it's a subset of a wider question, which is how you deal with volatility. And that's been a watchword for at least the last sort of 15 years. I mean, my view is actually that increasingly businesses, really since the financial crisis, businesses have had to face a world in which kind of external factors, which is everything from finance to macroeconomics to geopolitics, intrude into the decisions that businesses make. There was a time when of relative economic stability and continuity where businesses could be much more kind of internally focused. Now I think it's very important to have a wider view, which includes of politics, and to join the dots. We saw this in 2022 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The relationship between a war in Europe and inflation in this country, which affected absolutely everyone. These linkages are vital, and what we see is that businesses, I think, are interested in and concerned about building that understanding of external factors which can have a profound effect on their own business.
What was it, half the world's population
That's the stat,
voting in 2024?
GDP,
I think 70 countries or something, I think, around the world. And I mean, it is a time in which we're, still facing, conflicts in different parts of the world, where actually there's still quite a lot of uncertainty there. I mean, each of these elections that will be happening in 2024, they are all elections, but they also have their own story and culture of what's happening there. And I suppose for business, this landscape, this sort of sort of less consensual. We've got the European Parliament elections coming up as well. There's been quite massive changes, I think, there in the culture and approach within the member states in recent times. We've got the United Nations in terms of these international conflicts, migration. It's really difficult, but democracy has never been easy. It's never been easy, but elections, do offer an opportunity for renewal, for fresh discussions, for opening up that sort of wider sort of civil society debate about what's happening. And therein, businesses can make a real contribution as long as they stay close to people as well, wherever they're representing them around the world. And they can play a part as well in painting the picture about why, the local is really important, but so is the global.
Yeah. And looking to the future now, I mean, we've spoken a lot about the digital age and the challenges of that, but is there any hope there? Because, I mean, you look to perhaps, I don't know, Pakistan recently had an election. There was a lot of organisation on the ground through digital channels, lots of kind of greater access to information and facts. Does that offer some hope there as well as incredibly difficult challenges?
I think there is. I sort of, in recent years have obviously, as viewing events, have seen, how much access to information through digital platforms has been an amazingly liberating force. I mean, a lot of the discussion today is obviously very concerned, and there's right to be concerned about it. There's concerns about AI and deep fakes and all these things influencing elections. And I think in 2024, there's going to be a lot of people on guard about that. But actually, opening up, people from around the world to different viewpoints, to different ideas, maybe if they're not living in a very democratic environment, the opportunity, should they get there, to see how democracy could work in a better way for them and their families. The digital world can help with that, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing, but within it comes a huge amount of responsibilities as well.
Yeah. So we spoke at the beginning about how elections have had a long history and we're just a moment in time. What about if we look forward? Where do you think the future is for elections? Do you see a hopeful future? Do you see more polarisation, more conflict, or perhaps a combination of both?
I'm an optimist. I'm a pragmatist and I'm an optimist. I think you can be both, I think, really. I mean, look, elections, as I think we've talked about, it's not always clear-cut. It can be messy. But I actually do believe that countries that have elections are better off for it, economically, socially, and for so many reasons. And there are many countries in the world where actually, the chance to have, proper and open elections is something people are striving for. So I don't think there's necessarily a lack of ambition to have elections around the world. I think it's just, trying to make sure that they're right. So I'm hopeful for it. And I still think it's one of the best ways for accountability and to check the temperature of what people are thinking.
What about you, Ian?
I'm optimistic because I think that actually democracy, of which elections are part, represent the best way of maximising individual freedom and prosperity within a structure which kind of helps human welfare. And I think it's a hard business building democracies, but I think we underestimate how well ours in general work and how much the rest of the world would like what we have.
You'd miss it if it was gone, that's for sure.
How true. So I'm an optimist. I think it has a tremendous appeal.
To finish off, to wrap us up, we have come to the end of the episode. To take us back to our big question of the day, in one sentence or two, do elections change anything? Ian, I'll come to you first.
They do, not always. It depends on the calibre of leadership and the moment in time, but they do, and it's incumbent on us to take them seriously and to use them so that politicians can achieve change. Yes, they matter an awful lot.
100% elections do change lives. The older I get, I can look back and think, goodness me, I didn't have these rights in my lifetime, and then I acquired rights that I never thought I'd have. And then I look at my mother and look at my grandmother and just think, goodness me, how life has changed for the better because of elections.
Fantastic.
Great way to end it, I think. Nice.
Great.
Thanks, both.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We release a new episode every other Tuesday with another big question, so don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening or watching. That way, you'll be alerted whenever a new episode drops. This podcast is produced by our very own pod squad and hosted by Lizzie Elston, Ethan Worth and Annie Wong. Original music by Ali Barrett.